I love this Hosea passage. I love the parental vision of God, one that I think many would call maternal. I love the imagery of holding a child and teaching a child to walk, snuggling a baby and kneeling to feed a toddler. Hearing of God as one who cares for us like that has immense power. And actually, I love hearing God's frustration that people are missing the mark, because the mark is peace, not violence, and justice, not wealth accumulation, and compassion. And then too, I love God's self-restraint, God's anger that upon examination turns to sadness. That nurturing love didn't create the society of justice that God envisioned, yet that God's love isn't impaired by the people turning away. God is still defined by compassion, warm and tender for the people. The anger melts away, the love holds strong, and God returns to hope that people might be transformed by being loved. God dreams of the people returning to the divine and the ways of living that are compassionate. And the passage ends with affirmation of God's expectations that those hopes would be fulfilled. And I would really, really like to preach on this wonderful passage, but two things stand in my way. First, I'm not actually very good at preaching at passages that I agree with. I mean, what more is there to say than what I just said? And the gospel has its claws at me. The story of the bigger barns is uncomfortable in a multitude of ways. It forces us to face questions of security, consumption, capitalism, greed, and existential anxiety, which as 21st century Americans are things we spend a whole lot of energy avoiding as hard as we can. Oh, and it feels judgy. That's uncomfortable too. And often when we read it, we feel judgy and judged. So I would be all for ignoring it, except for the degree to which I want to look away from it suggests that I probably shouldn't. I feel for the man in the parable. He's worked hard, he happened to luck out and have a good harvest, and he finally feels like he can stop fighting for security and just relax a little. He can live life and enjoy it without fear of hunger. And then he gets slammed for it and he dies without even being able to enjoy that security, and he's judged for doing it all wrong. And this, as my first response, is real. And I suspect it involves a whole lot of projecting from the 21st century to the first, and an awareness of the many, many people who struggle to just have enough food to survive. But my initial instinctual response to the parable also required that I ignore actual details of the parable, because the setup that Jesus gives isn't the one I heard. Jesus says, the land of a rich man produced abundantly, which creates two immediate distinctions. The man was already rich when the story began, and he didn't actually do the labor for this harvest. In fact, I think it's actually even set up to make us aware that others did the labor, because from the man's perspective, maybe the land produced, but land does not farm itself. Laborers do the work, but the rich man doesn't even acknowledge them, nor clearly does he share the bounty that their work produced with them, because he owns the land, he owns the harvest, and he seeks to secure it, probably against the laborers themselves. That is, he wasn't actually lacking security to begin with, but he did keep others from having enough to survive. According to the social science commentary on the Synoptic Gospels, in ancient Mediterranean culture, it was assumed that all good existed in finite, limited supply, and were already distributed. Because a pie could not grow larger, a larger piece for anyone automatically meant a smaller piece for someone else. Now, we don't actually share that assumption anymore. We tend to think of goods as producible, so more can be produced if there is more that is needed. Although I suspect the truth is somewhere in the middle of our assumptions. When we keep thinking that more can always be produced, we end up taking unhealthy quantities of raw materials from the earth, and we don't pay as much attention to when some people acquire more than their fair share. When the pie is assumed to be a fixed thing, taking the biggest slice is unfair. But when there are several pies, even taking a whole one for oneself doesn't create the same outrage. The authors remind us that in that culture, an honorable man would thus be interested only in what was rightfully his, meaning what he already had. He would not want more. Anyone with a surplus would normally feel shame unless he gave liberally to clients or the community. Furthermore, anxiety about the future was not a peasant outlook. Anxiety about daily bread certainly was. So it turns out that my first reading of this passage involved identifying with and feeling compassion for the rich man who is taking an unfair share of the community's resources and feeling bad for him that he got judged for it, just in case anyone was wondering how internalized capitalism is going with me. I just keep getting shocked by these parables. I keep noticing as I read the parables of Jesus how much they illuminate the economic systems of today and how much I buy into them. I think the reason they illuminate today is a point that I learned from John Dominic Crossan, that the Society of Jesus was a pre-industrial agricultural domination systems, and ours is a post-industrial non-agricultural domination system, and they don't work that differently. Anyway, I keep on noticing that I don't have a first century peasant outlook on life, which seems pretty obvious, but might be important. For those who believed that goods were all limited resources and a zero-sum game, it was then really obvious to conclude that those who take too much are not being good neighbors or fair participants in the game. But in the USA in 2022, there are other narratives that counter that simple fact. We live in a society that believes that winners have the right to take what they win. And that means that everybody else just has to deal with less. Which means that we have taken away the moral assumption that people shouldn't build bigger barns. Now, let's get to the really hard part of this story. The rich man dies in the end. A la Steve Jobs, having all the money didn't make him immune from death. While the poor people worried about if they could eat today, like many, many do today, the rich man was worried about the future. And mortality was about to come calling. Not even the security of wealth and abundance changed that outcome. But whenever people build bigger barns, physically or metaphorically, I think they're doing so to try to create more security and to prevent death from coming for them, or at least coming for them as soon. Because in our society, having more resources does usually make it possible to have an increased lifespan until a certain point, and only usually. Because we live in a society that says you have to fight with others for resources, and some will get and some won't. Our shared narrative as a country is that those who are poor haven't worked hard enough, and we shouldn't help them and take away their motivation to work harder. Taken to its logical end, our form of capitalism says that some people win a right to a longer life and others don't. I hate this narrative. Not real fond of this parable either. Why is Jesus always sticking his nose in stuff? Anyway, I'm most struck in this story by the ways it reflects our own existential angst. And I want to talk about that today, not just in a personal way, but in a communal way. In my 9 years with this church, I've heard a lot about awareness of decline and questions of sustainability. Looking back on old records and minutes, these are conversations that date back a few decades as well. Because this church is one that is attentive to numerical trends, there's long been an awareness that the trend is one of decline. But I don't know how much that awareness has happened alongside emotional and spiritual work that could make sense of it. My fear is that for many in this community, it feels like if the church dies or changes, it means that the effort and energy they've given to the church didn't matter. And inside one's emotional system, that could very easily translate to, my life didn't matter because I gave my resources to a church and it didn't matter. I mention this because internal emotional systems don't do logic, and they're fine taking flying leaps. I need to say again, I think this applies either to the church dying or the church changing, because those who have given of time, energy, passion, prayers, presence, or money in the past to parts of the church, the parts of the church life that they gave themselves to, if those parts change, it's really hard, because I believe it is often experienced as rejection. And I believe it is often experienced as a rejection of the person themselves, which is awful. And just to be clear, untrue. Churches are a lot like living organisms. We need different things at different times. And a ministry or a group that is imperative to the well-being of the church in one season will not necessarily be in another season. That doesn't change the fact that it was imperative in its own season. And it doesn't mean that the gifts a person gave to that ministry or group didn't matter. I wonder if this is more audible another way. If you could think about a person who helped you along your way, someone who made a difference for you, a teacher or a mentor who believed in you, or someone who helped you get a resource or a connection you couldn't have gotten, or someone who had time to listen when you had something that needed to be heard. Okay, got one? Does it negate that action if it didn't last forever? Of course not. Our church isn't going to last forever because nothing does. But while it is here and alive, I hope that we will spend our energy enjoying ministry together and being a gift to our communities. I hope that we won't spend all of our energy trying not to die at the expense of actually living while we can. And I hope we can remember, each of us when it applies to us, that the gifts we've given to make this church what it is are of great value. And it's okay that seasons change. Because friends, we are in a new season, one we've never been in before. As we let go of the past, I invite you into some reflection. We are not going to build bigger barns, because heavens, we do not need a bigger barn. But we do have a choice of what to put in the one we have. When you think about the past, what was wonderful and life-giving about it? What qualities should we be trying to keep? And what might they look like now, which is quite likely different from how they looked in the past? That is, what matters most from the past to find a new way to have it in the present. And then we get to do some wondering about how we make sure those gifts we value immensely get to the workers in the field and not just the rich landowner. Oh, these parables. They don't ever just let things be, do they? Thanks be to God. Amen.